In 2010, about 6 months before the picture surfaced, me and two friends were driving around out in the country in Effingham, Illinois. We live about 30 minutes away from there. This was a typical weekend night, driving out to a cemetery to respectfully explore. We were told the Casbar Cemetery deep in the woods surrounded by caves outside Effingham was a really good place. We head to Effingham and stop for sodas at a gas station and then head to the country. It's about 1 to 2 a.m., so it's dark. I see something with yellow glowing eyes off the side of the country road just past the ditch in the headlights. Too short to be a deer, but too big to be a possum or a raccoon. As we get closer, it gets clearer, and I realize what I'm looking at is skinny, hairless and gray, human-like, but definitely not human. Crazy as hell looking thing. It was crouched down. Its arms were incredibly long and looked like it could have been 7 feet tall or bigger if it was standing. I can feel myself get cold and my heart race and my hair stand on the back of my neck. I kind of whispered to myself, "What in the fuck?" And then I heard my friend Harley in the back seat shout, "What the fuck is that?" Complete shock and terror set in, and I can't make a sound. I'm just staring at it. By that time, we are right in front of it, passing it, and it just watches us drive by. It slinks into the dark, and then we all just start screaming, literally freaking the hell out. I was convinced it was a demon for months, but still doubted myself even seeing it, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. We didn't even make it to the Casbar that night. We went straight home. I couldn't sleep that night. 6 months later, I'm at a different friend's house and she gets a text from her cousin. It was a trail cam picture. I went cold again, and the hair on the back of my neck stood tall again, because I was seeing this thing again. I knew we weren't crazy, that there was something to this. He said he caught it on his trail cam, 1 town over. He told us later it wasn't his camera and that he was just pranking us, but I immediately recognized it. I asked her to send me the picture and I sent it to Harley, and he quickly replies, "That's that fucking thing." I found out the picture was faked, but I still can't help but to have my doubts. I've researched the picture and demons to find some answers and I found nothing. Fast forward to October 2012, I'm on Facebook, and I come across a page called Weird Effingham, Illinois. So, of course, I start combing through the entire page, and I find reports of sightings around the cemetery of creatures with glowing eyes. Nothing as in-depth as what I saw, but still enough to tell me that we were not the only ones who had seen something like that out there. I researched demons and paranormal some more, but still nothing. 2014, I'm scrolling through my Facebook newsfeed, and the trail cam picture pops up. One girl I know posted it on the wall of another girl I know, so I immediately commented my story on it. When I go up to the previous comments, I see that one of the girls was talking about seeing one. She replied to my comment and told me that she had seen it in the country in Effingham too, back in 2011. This guy we went to school with commented on the status too and said that he had a friend that was super into the occult and that she said they're called ghouls. So I went right into researching ghouls. What I find blows my freaking mind. Lore says they are cave dwellers. As I said, previously the Casbar Cemetery is surrounded by caves. They feed on the freshly dead and normally stay close to cemeteries to be close to food. They have been known to show themselves to humans when trying to get close to them to eat in times where fresh deceased bodies are scarce. I went to images of them and could only find illustrations, but they look exactly like what I saw that night. Everything I was reading was falling perfectly into place, lined up perfectly with my experience. I couldn't explain it away. Then last night, I came across a Reddit post with a story so similar to mine with just as much detail. It was one of the most incredible things that has ever happened to me, and I will always search for more answers. Research ghouls when you get the chance. I wasn't going to post this, but what the hell. I'll take the risk of looking like a totally insane person. No one is going to believe me anyway. This happened when I was 17. I'm 32 now. I graduated high school and got my first apartment. Nice town. Lived by myself other than my cat Snowball. Don't laugh, I named her when I was 8. A few details before we get started. I've never been a fan of cat boxes. Worst part of being a cat owner, shoveling tiny shit with a tiny shovel every day. So I got one of those motion-activated self-scooping deals, left it out on the back patio, ran the cord inside to power it, and left the back sliding door open big enough for her to get in and out, about 5 to 6 inches. The patio was one of those 8x8 cement-floored types, surrounded by a 5-foot tall wooden fence. If you looked out from my bedroom door, you'd be facing right at the sliding door with hanging blinds, living room in between, kitchen that was off to the right. So, I'm playing some 56K Counter-Strike at the computer in my room with my back facing the door. It's about midnight, 1 a.m. I hear Snowball start to make one of those awful cat growling noises in the back of her throat. I'm pretty locked into the game, so I tell her to knock it off, not looking at her. She keeps doing it. I tell her to shut up. I'm irritated because I'm doing well in the round. And then she gets loud. This is enough to break me away from my gaming zone, and I realize that this is not normal. I get up from my computer to see her standing in the doorway, facing out, her back to me. She is in full-on Halloween cat mode, hair sticking straight out, her back is completely arched, and she looks tense. I had never seen her that way. She's still just going crazy, making that sound. I look out into the living room where she's facing. Nothing is amiss. There's nothing there. I look down at her to say something to the effect of, "What's the matter?" She makes this insane sound, like a combination of a hiss, a growl, and spitting, and she starts to take a few steps backward. That is when a tiny creature runs out of the fucking kitchen, on 2 legs, wearing a tattered piece of cloth or a bag. It looked like a little cloak. It's maybe a foot and a half tall. It's a real-life fucking jump scare. The cat jumps backwards about 3 feet in the air. I jump. I glance down at her as she does this, but quickly look back up. I hear her land with a crash behind me and run. I'm fixated on the thing. It's moving, but it's like time has slowed down. I'm watching these things happen, but everything is so fast. It runs out the back door through the blinds with a crash at speeds that don't even seem natural. The blinds are swinging. My heart is pounding. I stand there, dumbfounded. What the hell did I just see? I'm staring at the back patio door, at the swinging blinds. I'm not moving. My eyes start to notice that something is wrong. All the blinds are softly swinging, except the 2 closest to the opening. I see they're making an inverted V. I look at them and follow them down to the very bottom, and between them, I see it. Its head is poking through the blinds, staring at me. It has yellow eyes and a face that I can only describe as bestial. Gray, greenish, blackish skin. At this point, a singular, loud thought fills my mind. You aren't supposed to see this. And at the conclusion of that thought, every one of the hanging blinds shoots upward and outward, I jump again, and my heart tries to blast out of my chest like I'm fucking Cape Canaveral. Some of them hitting the ceiling. A few fall off. It's a loud racket, the rest are swinging all over the place. I look at the place where its face was, and it's gone. I beeline for the kitchen. Refrigerator door is open. I open a drawer and grab the biggest knife I see. I'm shaking, adrenaline like I've never experienced before. I rush to the sliding door and slam it shut. It won't close. I open it a bit and slam it back shut. Still won't close. What the fuck? I am completely stupid. The catbox cord. I crouched down, brandishing this knife like a complete idiot, looking out the glass door, waiting for this thing to launch at my face. I'm shaking. I reach across myself with my left hand to the power plug on the wall to the right as I stare out, waiting to stab anything that approaches. I fumble to get it unplugged. My hands won't do anything right. I finally get the cord unplugged, and I open the door real quick to throw the cord outside. I throw it like a spaz and it hits the wall and the side of the door and falls down, still inside. Fuck. I pick it up and try again this time, and this time it lands outside. I hear a scratching sound, and my eyes dart up. I see two tiny, awful fucking hands holding on to the fence. Clawed, gnarly, humanoid hands. This fucking thing climbed down feet first, hanging from the fence. It would have been slightly comical if it wasn't so fucking terrifying. The hands let go, and I hear it land in the bushes outside the fence, and I hear fast footsteps as it runs off. I slam the door shut and lock it. This is completely true. I've heard it all. It was a raccoon. It was a cat with mange trapped in a paper bag. It was none or either of those things. After the event, I started researching like a madman. Closest thing I found was in a book I found at the library called Fairies, which is like an art book featuring all the different types of Irish folk creatures. I don't live in Ireland. I live in the US on the West Coast. You don't believe this story, and I don't blame you. It sounds ridiculous. You probably shouldn't believe it. I absolutely hate the no sleep Reddit. I think it's stupid. I hate bullshit paranormal stories. Believe it or not, I'm a skeptic. I believe all people that have experienced something strange or believe in the paranormal should be a skeptic. I enjoy debunking paranormal videos and pictures. I want the truth. So, was I hallucinating? It's entirely possible I had an extreme and sudden hallucination. It's not unheard of. This event had a huge impact on my life and completely affected the way I view the world. Paranormal, religion, everything. The day was pleasant and festive. Opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8, after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took back roads to get there, so I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounded by a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of his development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives, or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights on in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour down to 20. There were no streetlights in the development, and for some reason I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so for a bit. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listened to music while driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car and it were exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light colored, not sure whether it was white, tan, yellowish, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off its back. I don't know what this was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. And it had pointed things atop its head, 2 things going straight upward, with something mingled between them. That's what I got from a quick scan and from my observation of it as it neared my car, and my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth opened wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I will never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill or shriek, enveloped by a deep, guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it all sunk in. Had my driver's side window been fully opened, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was. Has anyone else seen anything like this, or heard what I heard? When I was little, my family owned a cabin on a lake in rural Appalachia. It was pretty remote at the time, though it's been more heavily developed over the past 10 years. Anyways, when we would go to the cabin, we would often go for picnics in a huge field at the edge of a farmer's field. One day, we set up our picnic spot at the edge of a very steep hill. At the bottom of the hill, the field met the tree line of a very large forest. I was too young to remember everything that happened, but this is what I was told by my sister and my parents. We were sitting on the field eating when my dad heard really loud banging coming from the bottom of the hill where the tree line met the field. He walked to the crest of the hill and saw an enormous white creature standing on 2 feet and taking large logs and throwing them over its head to bang it off tree trunks to make the loud noise. He showed my mom. She saw it, and we decided to pack up and leave. They were pretty creeped out. Now, my parents are very sane and rational people, so they never really talked about it out of fear of sounding insane. No one really wants to claim that they saw Bigfoot. Well, about 4 years ago, we were having Christmas with my aunt and her family, who would also frequent a cabin on the same lake. We ended up talking about the cabin and were sharing memories when my aunt said she had an absolutely unbelievable story that she had never shared with anyone besides my uncle. She would always make wild blackberry jam in the fall, so she would often go picking for blackberries. One day, she said she thought she saw a bear in the distance eating blackberries and that it scared the hell out of her, but she continued to pick and watched it in the distance for a while. Well, eventually the thing she thought was a bear stood up, revealed its white coat of hair, and walked away on 2 feet into the woods. Obviously, we immediately shared our story, and everyone was in awe that we had seen the same thing at approximately the same time in the late 80s. I decided to do a little research, and it turns out there were a ton of sightings of this thing in the late 80s, and someone was actually so convinced that he saw Bigfoot that he dedicated the rest of his life to finding it again. You can look it up. There are numerous reports of people seeing this thing around the time that my family saw it. I am not sure I really believe that this guy found the Bigfoot again, but he claims he found 3 of them together. 2 big and brown and 1 with thick white fur. An exact description of what my parents and aunt independently confirmed. I don't really know what to think. The rational part of me knows it probably wasn't Bigfoot, but I respect everyone in my family's sanity and intellect, and everyone was convinced that what they saw was not a bear, and was covered in thick white fur, and walked on 2 legs. I don't know how you can explain that away. On a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other men, doing a shakedown test cruise, planned to be out for about 12 hours. Mid-1980s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50 miles per hour range, just this short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the one fellow on board who was the best sailor since the storm was almost on us. Otherwise we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a securite call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, but then it passed. We would live. This was at about 3 p.m., and although there was a cloud cover, of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles or so in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things off the seafloor. Now for the sighting. We're all on deck, working lines, checking damage, etc., and the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often used the saying, "the sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, and then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, and then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at that moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at that time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc., all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything. I mean, what could I say? I just saw a strange creature, take my word for it. The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D-skipper or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked on to the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a U.S. Navy captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface Navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said that they had seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day, and didn't speak of it again. For the record, everything I've written above is the truth. However, this is the internet. For all you know, I may be a dog, a brain floating in a jar making up stories, or a landlubber who's never even been to the beach. No, I don't have pictures, and if I did, wouldn't people say they were faked? I am well aware that a momentary glimpse of something on the surface of the sea is notoriously unreliable, and the mind and eyes and the imagination play tricks on people, even in the best of times. Nonetheless, I know what I saw. I am sharing this story due to the request of another person. This encounter took place in the winter of 2016 in Daviess County, Indiana. It was around 8 o'clock and very dark outside. I was out feeding my goats. The goat shed was about 300 yards away from my home. To get to the shed, I had to cross 2 small fields and walk along a narrow path through the woods. These woods border an Indiana naval facility. After I had finished, I began to walk back. I had crossed 1 field and was about halfway through the narrow path when I started to hear rustling in the underbrush. All I had with me was a little flashlight that only shined about 10 feet in front of me. I was almost to the end of the path when I spotted something. It was on all 4s with a bony frame, elongated limbs, and pale skin. While the first part of that description sounds pretty generic, it did seem to have a long and highly flexible neck. Not long after I noticed it, it noticed me and bolted down the path. It ran, almost scuttling, into the second field. This field had a small hill in the center, and this thing fled and disappeared over on one side. I ran as fast as I could around to the other side of the small hill and zigzagged back to my house, where I quickly locked all of my doors. This thing was terrifying, but it seemed watchful more than anything, at least for now. One night I was hanging out with my aunt and uncle when they randomly asked me if I believe in Bigfoot. I said I do not, but I had an experience I certainly can't explain away. My buddy and I were passing through rural McKean County, Pennsylvania, in the Appalachian foothills after spending time in my family's hunting cabin in neighboring Potter County. I was telling my buddy about McKean County's main tourist draw, the Kinzua Bridge, once the world's tallest railroad bridge. Sadly, a few years ago the bridge was felled in the middle of the night by a tornado, ripping apart its midsection and leaving only the portions of the bridge anchored into the hillside standing. On the valley floor are rusted, contorted steel beams, some reaching dozens of feet into the air. Even though it was fast approaching midnight, my friend wanted to do some good old-fashioned trespassing to check it out. So did I. It being late at night and in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't a soul around. We hopped over their laughable security apparatus, a rented chain-link fence that wouldn't deter an 8-year-old. It's close to a full moon, and we're now 100 feet or so above the valley floor on what's left of the former monolith. We're doing the stupid teenage, young 20s BS things that guys do. Leaning over the edge where there used to be hundreds more feet of track, spitting off the edge, pissing off the edge, you know, all the prerequisites. After we grew bored of that, we began to rip off chunks of railroad ties. It was scary how easy it was to do this to something that had very recently had trains running on it. Naturally, the only course of action was to throw these huge chunks of wood off the bridge and make some noise. We chucked the chunks, and when it hit the ground it made some noise, but oh my Lord God Jesus, the sound, the scream that came right after that will forever stick out in my mind. Outside of it being incredibly loud and urine-inducing, the best I can do is to tell you it sounded half primate and half industrial machinery, like metal screeching while hydraulics hiss. Then, whatever it was we spooked or pissed off started sprinting away through the forest. Mind you, it was a full moon, and at that hour we had good illumination. We could see sizable trees bending at absurd angles by something with an insane amount of size, weight, and strength. Even its footsteps made a ruckus among its primate-like grunts. Sadly, we weren't lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the beast through the dense forest canopy. Listen, I've seen a handful of black bear running in the wild. None of them made anywhere near that much noise while sprinting away. I was fortunate enough to visit South Africa once, and I saw a rhino sprinting through the safari just a few feet away from our jeep. Again, I say a rhino sprinting didn't even come remotely close to making that much noise. Nothing compares. Whatever it was has to be colossal. When I got back home in central Ohio, I scoured the net for a recording of bear and mountain lion calls. Nope, nothing sounded remotely like the scream we heard. I have yet to hear anything like it on the dozens of animal documentaries I've watched, or handful of remote camping trips. Once I concluded my story, my aunt and uncle's jaws were on the floor. I asked them what was up. As it turns out, there was some Bigfoot show on at the time, and they had just seen an episode that took place at, drumroll, the Kinzua Bridge. I didn't even know about the show's existence, and had never seen or heard of the episode, and neither had my buddy, so, again, I don't believe in Bigfoot. No authenticated print, droppings, or animal carcass. I mean, the odds of something like that alleged size not leaving a conclusive trace of evidence has to be next to impossible. Is it more likely my friend and I shared in a delusion? I guess that's more likely, but we were not tired, or impaired, or scared. I mean, until we heard that thing. In closing, everything I said is 100% what we experienced and true. I'll never forget it. I want a rational explanation, but it's almost 10 years later, and I have found absolutely nothing. So, in about 2012, my then boyfriend lived in Sweden. I live in Canada. He came to visit me, and during one of the evenings, I woke up to something strange perched at the foot of the bed. It was a pale, thin, humanoid figure. It was completely hairless, and the legs seemed to be bowed in some way. It seemed to walk on all fours despite looking human. I couldn't see much of it. Couldn't see much of its face. It was looking away from me. It looked a lot like the creature from the fictional story The Rake. When I gasped, it hopped off the bed and into the darkness. My partner heard me and woke to ask me what was wrong. I didn't tell him so as not to alarm him while he was trying to rest. In 2014, 2 years later, he was visiting once more and we were once again in bed sleeping. I woke up to hear my boyfriend screaming like I had never heard before. I immediately turned on the light and shook him to try and snap him out of it, but he just screamed and then cried. After 30 minutes or so, he was finally calm enough to explain what had happened. Apparently, he woke up to a pale, humanoid figure with a gaping mouth and black sunken eyes basically on top of him. As he screamed, the figure slowly backed itself into the closet while staring at him, crawling on all fours. I felt sick. I never ever told him about what I saw a few years prior. There's no way he could have known and described what I saw perfectly like that. Now here's why I'm posting. It's shown up again. My ex messaged me today, we're friends, and told me his now girlfriend has seen the pale man. They were asleep and apparently she woke up to see this thing stalking around the room. And it noticed her frozen in fear, so it crawled up next to her. My ex woke up and tried to console her. She described what she saw. It apparently was a perfect exact match to the thing we both saw. I only ever told him what I saw after his experience, and she had never heard either of ours. Is this just a mass coincidence of hallucinating while waking up? Is it a demon or some sort of haunting? A skinwalker? I'm really freaked out. My entire childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to his insomnia from shift work. Our neighborhood is considered very safe and ultimately was an urban neighborhood, besides one of the roads towards the back of the neighborhood being lined with a thick forest for about a mile, and about a quarter deep, which made a circle back in itself. All of these walks are very dear memories of mine, except one, and it ended up being the last one. Along the road with the tree line, there was a single street light to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was very common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we were walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stops, pulls me close, puts a hand over my mouth, crouches with me, and points towards the single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I see a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny, with long limbs, materialize out of the plot's brush line and cautiously take in its surroundings before signaling towards the brush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures materialize as well. After a brief moment of what looked to be a discussion, all 3 make a dash for the forest tree line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for our home, which was roughly a half-mile back. Mind you, my father is 6'5" and 220 pounds, and I was roughly 120 pounds at this time, and he never showed signs of slowing due to his fear and adrenaline. After this night, we never took late night walks again. He installed 4 bright motion detection lights around our acre plot and bought a dog for the house. The few times I've tried bringing it up, he doesn't want to discuss it and made it very clear that he never wanted to again. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the 3 huddled together is very vivid, even 15 years later. I lost a lot of time once. It's one of the few very creepy things to have happened to me, but this one really got to me. Still does. It only happened a few months ago. I went for a walk with my mother on a local path around a fairly large hill, a regular pastime of ours. We walked the 2 miles from the car to the hill before beginning our ascent to reach the loop, which is only about half a mile encircling the peak. We're from the area and have always known that people have come wildly lost up here, even though they know the path, and even though the path is the only one around the hill. It's sort of very specific knowledge. If you go 10 miles away, no one will know about it. We had been dozens of times before, but with the dogs usually. But today it was just my mom and I. We had never been lost before. So we've been walking for I don't know how long when I noticed something odd. The sun was in the same place to us as it had been for however long we've been walking, on a circular path. It should have appeared to move as we changed direction. We should also have been reaching that point where you headed down the hill, but our path was completely level. I was taught to use the sun and other natural signs to navigate, as I did spend a lot of my time just wandering, whether on horseback or on foot. I realized that I had no recollection of that part of the path and had been walking along in silence for... Well, here's the weird bit. Out came my phone, and it showed me that the time was about 2:37 p.m. I had absolutely no signal, even though it's usually spot on up there. We had set off at 11 in the morning, and all the hairs on my body stood up. This was a short walk, an hour and a half at most from leaving the car to getting back to it. The sun should have been above us, but it was set off, at where I would have said 3 o'clock for that time of year. I remember the time because when I turned to ask my mom what time she had, she looked straight through me like I wasn't there, and remained like that for a whole 3 minutes. She was just staring off into the space where I had been to her left. At 2:40, she suddenly came to life. I had moved away, too nervous to remain under her gaze like that after about a minute of saying "Mom" and nudging her rigid shoulder in a building, childlike panic. I was 20 at the time. I was sat on a log just off the path, getting pretty bloody freaked out. Mum glanced around and said in a hollow, weird voice, "I think the fairies might have us. We need to keep walking." I scrambled up and fell in to match her determined stride on this unfamiliar path. Why fairies, Mom? Why say that? I wasn't raised to see them as cutesy people with wings. You see, to me, they're straight out of nightmares. Because my mother's upbringing said that's what they are. Creatures out to confuse and trick. What time does your watch say, Mom? She always wears a battery-operated analog watch, and she lifted her wrist. 2:45. She put her wrist down and lifted it again to check. That's not right, is it? I just shook my head. All right, keep walking. So we did. We trudged on through this unfamiliar woodland for what I would have said felt like at most a half hour. It never turned a corner or changed elevation. I knew we were in bother when my stalwart, never frightened of anything mother began to get nervous. So, in response to her nerves, she becomes pissed off. She steeled herself, lifted those proud, all-seeing gypsy eyes to the creepy atmosphere, and spoke as she would to a lurking person. "Who's toying with us? Put us back." There was what I can only describe as a burst of deep laughter from the path behind us, and we spun around to face it. We were at the top of the hill that led to the gate to get out of there. It's at the fork, where you can go left or right, neither of which I remember choosing. Even though we always make a discussion of it, we made our way down the slope and out of the woods as calmly as possible and got back to the car, which was parked next to an ancient church and cemetery. The time in the car? 5:12 p.m. We should have gotten back to the car no later than maybe 1:45 if the walk had gone normally, or just after 4 when our watch and phone said we were approaching 3. So we lost nearly 5 hours. I've had a lot of creepy things happen to me, but this is about one of the worst. I wasn't alone. It was the middle of the day on a usually familiar path. Where did those hours go? Where was that path? So many unanswerable questions. I even went up there alone once, to see if I could experience it again, but nothing happened.